Victory Parade is time to give the crown to our 2024 Fantasy Ruckers OG League champion. And to do that, we bring on Rugby Morning's John Fitzpatrick to look back at the fantasy MLR season that was, talk about the matches that went down in week 18, and of course, look ahead to some early predictions on what's to come in the 2024 MLR playoffs. The Fantasy Rucker Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 115 of the Fantasy Rucker Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along of making fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. With you, as always, Ryan Yee, but not a usual host on this show. We got John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning here to join us here, which is awesome to see. Thank you, Fitzy, for joining in. And you can probably see that we are missing Matt Yee and Devin Vandy.
Where's everybody?
Coincidentally, on the show that is Rugby Morning, John Fitzpatrick's Victory Parade. After last week, we had the great reveal on our live stream that John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning won the 2024 Fantasy Ruckers OG League title, has his name etched in the history books, gets the $100 donated to the charity of his choice, and we'll get in more into that in this episode. But Fitzy, a week after your championship, it's got to feel good, man. It's got to feel good.
I think I've just about finished celebrating all the beers, the late nights, taking the Stanley Cup into the water, shirt off, on the, but I've done all of that. I am so disappointed that last year's champion couldn't even show up and give me my flowers by handing me the jersey and just bathing me in just praise and celebration. That's okay. I get it. I get it.
Again, I don't think it's a coincidence, man. They decided that they didn't want to show up. At least the commissioner, all right, the Supreme Commissioner lost fair and square to you in the semifinals. All right, going to take it on the chin. Learning experience, going to come back and fight for another title in 2025. But at least I had the cojones to come here on my show and face the noise that is John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning. And hey, like I said, give you the flowers, give you your parade. It's your time to shine. You had a stellar fantasy MLR season. Really, no hiccups for you throughout the year. It wasn't as turbulent as other, I think, fantasy teams, because every time I refresh that standings page, it seemed like you were in always around that top three.
I will say, I did get very lucky in a number of weeks. There were at least 2 or 3 weeks there where I had some injuries or suspensions. And for whatever reason, my opponent either had like the worst offensive performance or the second worst, right? And there were a couple of moments, maybe like week 10 or 11, I got to go back and take a look at it, where maybe I won by a few points. Had it turned the other way, who knows what would have happened. So, yeah.
Like I say, it's all about buying your ticket into the fantasy playoffs. And then from there, who knows what's happening. It's a week-by-week competition at that point, do or die, like we mentioned a few episodes ago while we were in the thick of the fantasy MLR playoffs. But hey, you're the one that came out on top unscathed, won through the playoffs, and here you are with your very first fantasy MLR championship, which is cool to see. We'll dive more into it. Fitzy, don't worry. This whole show is about you. Again, we're titling it the Victory Parade. So all of this is centered around Rugby Morning here. But we got a jam-packed episode. We did have the final week of the regular season in Major League Rugby, which I think we learned a lot from. So we're going to break down week 18 in this episode. We're also going to have a little bit of a fantasy MLR reflection of the takeaways from the 2024 season heading into playoffs. Give maybe some early playoff thoughts heading into the revamped playoffs that we are having here in 2024. 3-week break, which is pretty crazy, which we'll get into too. And then in the end here, like our typical segments, we're going to have the OVALYe with Vandy, who is not here, presented by OVALYe, and also our Devin's Degenerate Dambles, which I'll be taking over here to talk a little
Nice.
bit about the MLR betting side of things. But hey, before we get into it, like we say every single episode, if you aren't already, follow us at the Fantasy Ruckers. We had a stellar 2024 Fantasy MLR season, first season that we opened it up to the public. We had 4 other leagues outside of our main OG league for the first time. Great response. Over 45 different league members that had a blast trying Fantasy MLR for the first time. And the way they found out how to join and that there was availability was through the Fantasy Ruckers. Hey, this journey is continuing to go. So hey, you'll want to follow us at the Fantasy Ruckers for next season so that you can join us and tag along on this journey that is Fantasy MLR. We also have the weekly challenge that continues to go. We'll get into that. This show might be all about you, Fitzy, but there's going to be a little tidbit where I think I'm going to be able to take the spotlight here. A little bit of
Congrats. Yeah.
looking
I
ahead.
saw that.
But you can still get your first taste of Fantasy MLR here in the weekly challenge format that we have heading into the playoffs. This is something that we've done every single year. We've had the weekly playoff challenge, but we've extended it through the entire season, which was a lot of fun. And hey, do the good stuff. Like, subscribe down below. We have links to all of our Discord in the description. You can check out the fantasyruckers.com that has all the stats from the season. It's a nice little resource. I know that there are even people that don't play Fantasy MLR that use the fantasyruckers.com who just like to be in the know, whether it's because you're playing OVALYe, whether it's because you're betting. It's just a good resource.
You need some
to have.
stats. You need some more player stats.
It's the perfect place to go, the
Seriously.
fantasyruckers.com. So yeah, and then Fitzy, for you, before we get into it, hey, give Fitzy's little venture a follow at too. Rugby Morning, we mentioned it before. It's a great email for you to join. Daily email.
I've got a GoFundMe page to fund Maddie's pity party. So if you just want to go, if you want to donate that,
there you go. And to find that link, you'll have to subscribe to Rugby Morning's daily email. Sends out every morning a nice little curated email about all things going on in the rugby world, both domestically and internationally, and obviously in Major League Rugby, which is cool to see. Follow him on socials at Rugby Morning. All right, Fitzy, you ready to hop right into this thing before we kind of dive into the fantasy side of things? Let's talk about some news and notes because it might be the tail end of the regular season. But there's some shocking announcements that are happening throughout the MLR. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the stepping down of Sam Harris of the Chicago Hounds. And it looks like we have our second coach here that will be stepping down here that will not be returning for 2025. And that is head coach Steve Brett of RFC Los Angeles. Won't be in for 2025 at the helm for LA. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's right. RFC LA inaugural season, 5 wins, 10 losses, and a draw. Probably not the way they drew it up. Taking staff and players from Atlanta and coming to Los Angeles. Certainly, they played in Dignity Sports Health Park, right? The big one, the big stadium where the Chargers played, and some games were in part of the complex, another part of the complex. But I gotta say, across the board, given all of the changes and the fact that they had to relocate a lot of people and get a lot more players into the league. And they also had a bunch of injuries. Dan Hollins had their fly half, he went down and out early. Andrew Coe was suspended there for a little bit. Semi Kunutani seemed like he was suspended every now and then for some stuff. I mean, sure, they finished at the bottom of the Western Conference, but they won games. They were competitive in games, and they had to play a bunch of young talent. In fact, they played some young American talent, right? Sean, who had to step in for a number of years. So you would like to think that, Steve Brett may have had a little bit of a longer leash, right? You got to let him build something there. I guess the results just weren't what LA wanted. And now we've got a coaching change, which is interesting.
And it is interesting, and it's tough because, again, I think to your point, Fitzy, is that this was a guy that moved from Atlanta to LA with the franchise.
Yeah.
But if the decision, and this is where I'm kind of going against the franchise's decision here, is that if your thought, that, and I think the early years of a brand new franchise are the pivotal years. You want to establish a culture that's going to grow. You can build a foundation, and it starts often with your head coach. And I get it. 1 year results, maybe not what they thought to their standard, but we know how hard it is to win in this league
Hmm.
when you're a brand new franchise. I mean, look what happened to Dallas. I mean, what before it heading into the season, they had what, like 2 wins, I
Hmm.
think, heading into this year. So it's difficult as a brand new franchise to come in. And I think a lot of these decisions need to be looked at long term. I'm not too critical about the decision of them not extending past this year, but if you knew that you were going to go a different route when you first established this franchise, why not establish that earlier on? Now you're kind of resetting
Hmm.
to zero right now. I guess you have an opportunity here to kind of reset that and establish that franchise, but I feel like it was so important to establish that in your first season. Now it's kind of up to question. Now you got to kind of reset things. And not that it goes to waste, but this first year that was by all means not necessarily a failure kind of goes to waste because everything you tried to establish in the first year of your franchise now kind of
Yeah.
goes out the window.
I mean, that's, I guess, my question. What was their expectation with the roster that was
Sure.
built going into week one? Going, okay, how is this season going to go for us? What is the expectation? Is it to get to 500? Is it to make the
Right.
playoffs? Is it to win a game? I mean, if you look at their record, Dallas, which got the 4th seed, they only won 6 games, right?
Mm-hmm.
But competitive in all the games, right? RFCLA, 5 wins in an inaugural season. And if you look at Miami, another inaugural franchise, right? They finished with what, nearly the same record.
Right.
They had 6 wins and 10 losses, right? So,
Yeah.
I just wonder what the expectation was for Steve Brett and this roster going into the season. If the expectation was to get into the playoffs, which
And the
is
way
putting a
that
lot. Yeah.
right, and the way that they're wording it makes it seem like it was not, a mutual decision to kind of step away, right? Like it says that,
Hmm.
we have decided not to extend the contract. So it seems like, and the reason why we're kind of framing like this, because it's a completely different story if maybe, Steve Brett has other opportunities elsewhere that he wants to pursue, right? That would be a different story here. But the way that the franchise worded their post, how they're decided not to extend the contract, it sounds like it's their decision to kind of go in a different direction.
Do you think
And
they had someone waiting in the wings and they were just kind of waiting for the first season? Like you almost wonder
maybe,
what's going on
maybe,
there.
maybe. But then
Yeah.
again, it's to my point at the beginning. It's just maybe that move wasn't possible to make at the start because
Hmm.
things were moving so quickly.
Hmm.
But I think it is a bigger impact than what people may perceive, that not having that established culture and going in the direction you want to go with right away when you first enter the league versus now a year later you tried to build something, you've had somewhat of a success, and now you're kind of throwing that in the trash bin and now
Yeah.
moving forward here in a different direction. But we'll see, and I'm sure there will be an announcements coming in the near future on
Yeah,
what
attractive
direction they're going to
attractive
go.
job. They got some
It is,
pieces there.
it
It's
is
it's in
Los
Los Angeles.
Angeles.
Who doesn't want to play there? So
Right,
maybe
right.
Michael
So
Hooper's coming. What?
oh, well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that. But we got to talk about some more solidified
Yeah.
news here before we get into some of the gossipy type stuff here. We are a credible show here on the Fantasy Ruckers. But we'll start off with, I guess, a guy on your team,
Yeah.
Fitzy. You're obviously a well-known. It is well known that you're an Old Glory DC fan. You
Yeah.
have the Glorious Rugby podcast that you host with
Yeah. Yeah.
our website guru, Alistair Kirschpool, that people can find anywhere they get their podcast. So we got to talk about this. Danny Tusitala announcing on social media that after 5 seasons, he will not be returning to Old Glory DC. Um, he's a guy that has been a
Yeah.
pivotal piece of that Old Glory DC franchise for a long, long time. I think it was up until, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, last year where he basically played every single match.
Yeah. The
I think up
second to
until,
last match of last
right.
year's season. Yeah. Yeah.
And from a fantasy perspective, he was electric,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Before, this season. We'll get into kind of his impact this season, but I mean, he was the highly touted, 9 heading into this year in fantasy rankings.
Hmm.
Just the ability for him to be explosive and very with the attacking mindset. Tusitala was a guy that would score a lot of points. This year, kind of weird. I don't know if you have any inside knowledge with that, where they
Yeah.
had, who is it that was starting for you guys?
You had Connor
Buckley coming off the
Buckley,
bench,
Ethan McVie, who
right,
who who I think, and we'll talk about this. They started playing so well that it
right.
was hard not to keep them on the field. That the competition between those two guys kind of won out, and Danny kind of found himself on the outside looking in, trying to get minutes.
So let's talk about that
Yeah,
then.
yeah,
What are your thoughts on his departure? What are your thoughts on how Old Glory DC approached this season, having
yeah.
Danny Tusitala, and really not being any sort of an impact, both fantasy wise or for their team, in this 2024 year?
Yeah, I don't. I think the plan was for Danny to come in and he was going to compete. They brought in McVee, from the American Raptors. They brought in Buckley from the expansion draft from New York. So like this job wasn't Danny's to just walk into, right? There were guys there who could play and who'd played in high level competitions that were, hey, when are going to chip away and not make it easy for Danny. I think from what I've heard from a few people was that Danny came into camp he wasn't in the best of shape coming into camp. And I think he was a little late coming into camp too, where the other guys like Connor and Ethan had a little bit of a leg up. And then as the season was going on, they were just playing well enough that, you're only going to put 2 scrum halves on your match day 23. And
Mhm.
it was hard to take either one of them off the field because they were playing well. It wasn't like they were playing poorly.
Right.
And then I think that their play and their competition kind of, I don't know if there was any turmoil with Danny. I don't want to make any
Sure.
speculation there,
Yep.
but I don't think Danny was probably too pleased with maybe the shape he was in, and maybe just the direction of where the team was going. Because it got to the point where he just wasn't even showing up on the match day 23, right?
Yeah. And if
And
we
then,
look at a fantasy perspective,
yeah,
right, only appeared in 3 matches, all
yeah,
coming off the bench.
yeah,
Rounds 4, 5, and 6 were the only weeks we saw Danny. Played a total of 110 minutes all
yeah,
season long.
yeah,
5.3 fantasy points. He might be, and this is putting all kind of politics, actual league play out there from a fantasy sense. Danny might be one of the biggest busts in this 2024 fantasy season because he was one of the first
hmm
nines drafted off the board with the expectation that he kind of had that job, and it was
yeah.
really one of the most stable nines to have, and actually turned out being quite the opposite. So pretty crazy to see though.
Crazy, but I mean, his away message was perfect, right? What he announced was perfect. Nothing but
Right,
love for Ogoy. I don't think there's necessarily hard feelings. They just probably
right,
didn't end the way they
right.
wanted it, both sides. But I mean, he said, "Hey, any MLR clubs looking for a 9 in 2025." Gets me thinking that like he's gonna come back next season in shape, ready to play, and whatever team wants to have Danny Tusitala make it a pretty stellar scrum half. Now I know he's getting up there, in experience and in age a little bit there, but the idea of potentially an explosive Danny Tusitala coming back into the league, I'm sure some MLR clubs will be very interested in that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think out of all the positions that are maybe very, very lackluster in terms of depth in what teams are looking for, 9 is right up there. I would
Yeah.
put 10 right up there too. There's not a lot of teams are desperate needy, especially with some injuries happening and as well. Um, I could easily see Danny Tuzitala hopping into another role. I mean, if we go down the list, right? Nines that I would still keep, right? That teams have nines, right? You got Andre Warner,
hmm
right? Obviously, you're not doing anything with him.
Nope.
JP Smith, he's not going
Although
anywhere.
I had him all season long, and he had a couple of games, but for the most part, not the fantasy production that he had the
Sure,
year
from
before.
fantasy
But
perspective, but
yeah,
I'm just saying from a roster
a guy
perspective,
you're going
right?
to start because yeah,
Where could Danny
hmm
Tusitala find himself in the MLR, right? So
yeah.
JP Smith, not obviously he has his role solidified in Seattle. You got I'm
John
trying to think.
Poland, if he comes back
Don
healthy,
Poland,
yeah,
he'll be good.
yeah,
I want to go through the teams here. You know, Juan D. Oliver probably keeps his spot there.
yeah.
Nola Gold, you got
Luke Campbell,
Luke Campbell, Chicago
maybe
Hounds, you got
Damian
Nick
Stevens.
McCarthy,
Yeah,
right? So I mean, and then Miami
it's
Sharks, you got Kubeli. So you
yeah.
got, I think San Diego would
I mean,
happily take a 9.
I
I
don't know.
think,
Two. I mean, what's his name?
oh,
Tupai.
Tupai, sure. Forgot, but he
But
was in and out of the
yeah,
lineup towards the end of the season, so not sure
Kieran
what happened
McClay
there.
had some monster games for
It's
Utah
true.
at the end.
So
But you're right. Like you're, I feel like you're always going to need a scrum half that can make something happen,
right,
right? That can
right,
make a break. And Danny is known for that, like around the edges, around the breakdowns, like
right.
finding a little hole and taking off.
Absolutely.
So
All right. So it'll be interesting to see where
yeah,
Tusi Tala ends up. It's funny and interesting that he does make it clear out there that, hey, if any MLR team is looking for me, my services are available, which will
yeah,
only make this offseason more and more interesting. I just want to quickly gloss over this. NPC Bunnings rosters are being announced.
yeah.
From a fantasy perspective, No worries. We see this every single offseason. The way that the timing works is that as the MLR season approaches its end, NPC Bunnies Cup kind of ramps up, and then these boys, as long as that they don't sign any other long-term deals in other leagues through this kind of step up to the Bunnies NPC, we should see them back in MLR jerseys. So Manawatu Rugby announcing 5 US MLRs that are joining their squad. You got Johan Mumson and Drew Wild, Malachi Halagnatai, Jason Emery, and Luke Campbell going in that space. We also had several announcements from other teams like earlier in the year. So again, just keep an eye out. Don't
Michael
be too
Manson,
worried from a
please stay
fantasy
healthy.
perspective. Yeah, there you go. But I wouldn't be too worried about guys going to the
Yeah.
Bunnings NPC and coming back here ready for the Major League Rugby season. All right, what we alluded to here, Fitzy. Let's get into some gossipy stuff.
Yeah.
All right. I know you love talking about rumors going around the league, so let's get into some. And one of the things that was circulating around the MLR was the possible joining of a guy who has made a name for himself in Australian rugby, Michael Hooper, potentially coming to the MLR. Kind of fishy. I was following that as well. Saw the post on Reddit.
Yeah.
Went to the article. The article, I think, was since taken down or something. Like you couldn't access it.
Yeah.
The article also cited that he was going to be joining the Giltini. So again, not the most credible start of linking a guy to the MLR of Michael Hooper's stature, but it is something. It is not nothing. So I mean, what are your thoughts? I think it is not going to happen. There's no chance until I see something more substantial. I'm not going to believe it until I see it. But I mean, to have Michael Hooper join the MLR, that would be crazy. That would be probably the biggest name, like one of the big. I mean, you got Nanu in there, like some guy overseas that has come here and really. I mean, Michael Hooper. He's Michael Hooper of Australian Road. Like it would be incredible.
Look, there's been a number, right? Like I think Nanu is probably, it's funny. Like Nanu is probably the biggest one, of course, that has come over and played. Chris Robshaw, right, from England, another big name. I mean, yeah, there's been Michael Spate, right? Like another Wallaby. So like, Matt Cato, there's been Wallabies that have come over here, right? And of course, from the Giltinis days, a number of those guys. Look, if Michael Hooper were to come over, great, big name. Maybe it'll get some more like overseas coverage. But if he's not, obviously he's not the player that he was anymore, and he's just coming over to. I don't think that's how Michael Hooper would be, though. I feel like if he did come to MLR, he would train and try and be fit.
I mean, even half of a Michael Hooper is better than probably 75% of the MLR. You know what I mean? I don't think it ever hurts to have a guy of his stature to join the league. Yes, it does matter whether or not he's actually here to play rugby, or if he's here, like, for example, if he's really tied, it's obviously the Giltini is not in league anymore, but let's say he goes to a place like Los Angeles, like a high marquee place, right? San Diego. A place where, you can live the American lifestyle for a bit here and play a little bit of rugby on the side. I think still the exposure and the newsworthiness of having Hooper in the MLR would still be cool. Again, not gonna believe it until I see it though. The other rumor I want to get into though, and this is kind of starts out with not a rumor, but then now it's kind of questions are arising, is outside of MLR circles, obviously huge hype with Luis Rees-Zammit of Welsh Rugby. Signing with the Kansas City Chiefs. Kind of a crossover here. Vandy loves this type of stuff. Obviously, fantasy football is a big thing here. And Zammit has made that crossover from rugby to the NFL, just like how we made the crossover from fantasy football to fantasy rugby.
Yeah, exactly.
The thought is that he really didn't have a chance to make a spot. Now, I've been on record saying that I think he'll end up at the very least being on the practice squad. Like, I don't think he's going to get cut. Like, and there's also through these international pathways, like you have, like, I think it's like a 3-year period where you don't take up a roster spot. And you
Christian
kind of
Wade.
right. You're kind of that additional guy. So I think Luis Rees-Zammit has that to his advantage. He's trying out as a running back. Training camp is just around the corner. I mean, if you had a guess, Fitzy, between a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're the most confident, 1 being the least confident, what are the chances that Luis Rees-Zammit is in a Kansas City Chiefs jersey come August preseason time or September when the season starts?
Yeah, I'll play a little conspiracy theorist here, right? The NFL is obviously trying to get more audience and eyeballs in Europe, right? Like you've seen the London series. They're exploring games in Germany. They want more of an international audience. Here you've got this this young Welsh rugby star, right? He's only what, 23, 24 still, right? He's got, good looking dude, right? The glitz and glamour and all that stuff. So certainly the hype machine is there, right? They want to talk about him because they want those clicks, they want the links. Will he at least make a practice squad? More than likely, probably yes, right? Again, because to your point, he won't take up a roster spot there. You could develop in a little bit more. I would give him, he's playing a little running back, maybe a little kick returner, a little more punt returner, maybe a little, you find ways in the backfield to get him running in space, screen passes or coming out of the slot. I would 2 months ago, I would have put it at maybe like 4.5, like him making an active roster. Maybe I'm buying into the hype machine a little bit, but I'm going to put it at 6. I think 6 out of 10 that he is going to make an active roster. And I feel good about that because I think there's something about him. I think he seems to be a quick study. He seems to be, meshing well with the players. This is everything that I'm reading. We know he's athletic. We know he's good in space. We know he's got the ball skills. Can he pick up the playbook? Can he adjust to having the helmet on and the vision a little, not, a little bit more impaired, right? Obviously.
Yep.
Can he pick that up? I think we will see in their scrimmages and in that first preseason game when we get a look at him. I think he's got the physical skills to do it. Can he pick up that playbook and can he make a mark? We know he can tackle. So maybe at the very least, he's a special teamer and he continues to find ways to get on the field. But again, I'm putting it about a 6 right now, man. I'm buying into the hype. I'm buying into
it. I can't say that I'm that high, but I agree with you in a sense that if he is to possibly, and I still think it's a far stretch, but if he is to possibly make a roster spot, it would be as a special teamer, and maybe he can find his way into these kind of gadget type plays. And if there's any better team to do that, it is the Kansas City Chiefs.
And Andy, as rugby fans, we want him to make an active roster. I think that looks good.
If he makes an active roster in all my fantasy football leagues with my last pick, I'm picking Luis Rezamet no matter what. Like even if it's like the worst pick in the history and he doesn't even see, like just to have him and see his picture. I mean, talk about crossover. I mean, to see him on my Six Nations, fantasy leagues on there when you're picking obviously your weekly lineup there, and then to a year or two later see him on your Yahoo or ESPN or Sleeper fantasy roster is pretty funny. But we'll see.
The biggest thing is they always say like guys look fast, when they don't have any pads on, right? Their shirt's off, they've got like, and they're running fast. Like, sure, if you're a top athlete and you run fast, it's when you put on the pads and the helmets, can you still maintain that acceleration, that separation, that top line speed, that change of direction, which he has from playing international rugby. If that can translate over into NFL, or if he can keep that speed and acceleration, I think he's got a shot. That's why I'm thinking 6. So we'll revisit this conversation when he makes the active roster.
When he says when, not if, when. That's a truly spoken rugby fan there. But I mean the whole rugby community is cheering for him. It would be so cool. I'm not doubting it because of being against a rugby player being in the NFL. I mean, that would be awesome. That'd be sweet. It's just that jump has really been
he's competing against guys who played high school,
right, at that skill position. Like I see like those rugby players, those other athletes that maybe join the offensive, like that are just big guy and they can kind of physically tool wise they have that advantage to them. Now Luis Rezamet, again, his X factor is the space that he has in open field play. That doesn't often happen in football, but when it does, the guys that can make those explosive plays are a big advantage. You're thinking about also kick returning, punt returning, which really fits his type of play style. And I'll end on this point, is the only thing that kind of gives me pause is his numbers when it came to the combine before. Now, this was before he got signed, were very, very average compared to some of the other guys that you were seeing. And again, I know those are just numbers. The X factor that's going to help him out is his kind of play, his explosive ability.
His numbers were decent though, as for a running back though, if he's playing a running back position.
We'll see.
What I mean?
We'll see. Nonetheless, though, we'll definitely keep tabs on this and see where LRZ goes here. As NFL training camp is just around the corner. Like I said, though, mark it down now. I'm in the fantasy football league with Vandy and with Maddie, a league that's been going on for like 15 years plus now. You can count on me definitely drafting LRZ, like I said, if he does make it to the Kansas City Chiefs roster. But all right, let's go. I don't know what part of the show, if this will be one of your favorite, Fitzy. I know it's Maddie and Vandy's part of the show.
I love this part.
let's get right into it.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye.
All right, hear ye, hear ye. Here is Supreme Commissioner Yi with a Fantasy Ruckers Leagues update. It's weird doing that intro without hearing any of the boos from Maddie and Vandy when trying to interrupt that noise. I do appreciate the fact, as the champion, you do somewhat take
Yeah,
the
had I
time.
lost the championship, I might have been like,
Right,
boo.
exactly,
So
exactly. But hey, we got lots of things to update the people on. The first thing, this is your chance, Fitzy. This is your time for your victory parade. And we did mention at the top of the show, Fitzy is our 2024 major fantasy MLR, Fantasy Ruckers OG League champion. And there are some we've done 3 years of this officially where we've kept track of this. And this is the time, Fitzy, I think. This is the time. This is the time. It took forever for me to
it
get
looks
this
so
for Maddie,
beautiful.
but I am presenting you with
Yes.
the official
Look
Fantasy
at that.
Ruckers League Championship jersey. Kind of
Beautiful.
getting obscured in the filter, but I don't know if you'll be able to see it. The
That's
name
okay. I can
is
picture. I'm
on
slipping it
there.
on right now.
Yeah, gotta get the filter in, but it has 2024. It did fit the full name on it. John Fitzpatrick.
Let's
Rugby
go.
Mornings on there. We now have your name on. There are 3 official names here on the championship jersey, which is cool to see. We're also donating $100 to was it the DC Youth Rugby
Yep. Thank you.
Foundation.
Yep.
So we will be doing that as well, and we'll let the people know when that transaction goes through.
Yeah.
But hey, Fitzy, congratulations, man. We gave it to you at the top of the show, but we'll say it once again. Big time win there for you, bud. 2024 Fantasy MLR champion.
Thank you, Ryan. I've got to say, it's been a journey. Year 1, you're right. You said we've done this for 3 years. Year 1, I made the playoffs. I think I lost in the first round. I don't recall who I lost to. Year 2, obviously, I get to the championship final. It's coming down to me and Maddie. I made a couple of boneheaded roster decisions in the final. Maddie deserved a champion, had a strong. I even said at the beginning of the year he had the best team in fantasy rugby history. So, like, he had to
There
win.
you go.
Coming into this year, I thought my draft was okay. I thought Maddie had the best draft in fantasy history. In fact, I thought he had the strongest lineup. And the only way he didn't make the playoffs is if he just completely botched it. Now, he didn't completely botch it, of course. And I've got to say, I was quite impressed by your handling of your roster, even if you did hide some of your transactions.
Okay, if we don't need to talk about that.
So congrats on getting to, because you beat me twice in the regular season, and I was very nervous going into that semifinal match there that you were going to do a clean sweep, but my boys came through. And yeah, it feels good. You know, it does certainly feel good. Now, see, look, the best part is Matty Yee's reign of terror is over.
Right.
And now my reign of fantasy dominance begins.
And that scares me. Let me tell you, that scares me. That really does scare me. There's one guy outside of my brother that I don't like losing to, and that's you.
That's okay. I get it. I talk some junk in the Discord, but that's just to mix things up. It's all in good fun. I mean, I don't try to be mean spirited behind it. It was a slow day. I saw something. It looked a little funky. I thought I would stir things up between our matchup.
You watch yourself. I got the power. This is the Supreme Commissioner Yee's update segment. I just like to mention here. Everyone's got to remember. I still got the power. I might be playing in the league now. This is still the Supreme Commissioner you're talking about. But hey, nonetheless, got to give a shout out to you though. Congrats, man. I couldn't be happier. Also, that just like, again, kind of get sentimental. It's been just such a fun ride to kind of go through this, and we'll get this more into the fantasy MLR review. But
and cheers to Stephen Lowen too. Stephen Lowen had a phenomenal year. Like, I mean, could have won. Would have been a deserving champion too had he won. OG too. So you know.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I will say though, he took it up a notch this year. He was the king of winning the toilet bowl, and this time he finally got his shot at winning the actual championship. Didn't get it done. He'll learn for next year. Sad enough though, he actually lost both of his championships.
Does Matt McCarthy get relegated? Does he?
You know, we might make a special rule. I talked about the special powers that Supreme Commissioner has. That guy's all talk. I think this is back-to-back years now that he's finished and not made the playoffs. So we'll see. Again, questionable picks too. We'll get into that later in the season. But again, it was a fun year. But something that we also implemented for the first time this year was our weekly challenge.
Yeah.
That was a fun thing too, for people who kind of just wanted to dabble their toes in fantasy MLR without making that full season-long commitment. It was a way for you to do that. $15, build a 5-person lineup, see how you did on a weekly basis. And Fitzy, you may have won the Fantasy MLR OG League Championship. But guess who came in the clutch in the final week of the weekly challenge to come through, beat my brother, hold off you, who was coming from the back there to try to overtake both of us. And I retake the crown there, which I had for majority of the season. Don't let my brother get through it. So I think the best thing that we both can agree on here on this episode is that I think we're taking happiness in the fact that my brother came out with nothing this year. Absolutely nothing. He has nothing to show for any of the hard work, the great draft, any of that he has this season.
I mean, I was impressed you were able to hold off everyone. I was charging up. I know, Steven was charging up. We had a couple other members in the Discord charging up. I kept poking around. That was fun. I liked the ability to be able to maneuver the roster around, pick up a guy that was $1 that you had maybe just had a hunch was going to pop off.
Yeah.
I didn't start taking it really seriously until I looked at about round 5, and I got really lucky when Noah Brown for Chicago absolutely went off. And that kind of springboard me back into like contention. I was like, all right, okay, now this is serious. Now let's try and figure this out.
I said it last episode. I said I'm going to go heavy New England Free Jacks, and I'm using the strategy that a lot of fantasy managers use in terms of picking the guys that are against Anthem RC, and it paid off. Quattrin going off, Wayne Vanderbank going off, all that good stuff. So
I only used Michael Manson once, and that was in round 6. He did get 32 points for me, but that was the only time I used him in weekly, which is crazy.
Yeah, I don't think I picked it's hard to get those $5 guys in your lineup, especially the way Utah was playing. That's points. But nonetheless, fun weekly challenge. Again, we're going to continue this format.
Yes.
The season-long format may be done, but you can continue to play the weekly challenge. We're going to reset the rankings. We've got 3 rounds of playoffs to play. And instead of what we have done in previous seasons where you pick that 5-man lineup at the start of the playoffs, you're going to actually be able to change those players each and every week. So just like our weekly challenge format, it's just about your strategy and picking the right guys each and every week. So to finish off, Fitzy, you finished you finished 3rd on the season. 2nd this past week just wasn't enough. We'd like to give a shout out though to the league community member, the Fantasy Ruckers community member that is not on this show that can't speak. We want to give a shout out to Corleone, who did well in the weekly challenge. He was able to rack up a total of, as I pull it up here, a total of 50.7 fantasy points here. So 2 behind, just less than 2 behind you. I mean, I killed it this week. 66 points. Holy, incredible. What a way to end off on a bang. But nonetheless, weekly challenge is fun. Join in. Maddie finished 2nd on the season, 4th this week. We don't even need to talk about Vandy. Mediocrity. I think he finished like 9th or something. That's what he's best known for. It was a fun time. And we're excited for it to continue here after this international break for a few more. But before we get into the international break and before we get into the playoff conversation, we do got to talk about quickly here at Fitzy, week 18. And I know on your rugby morning email that you send each and every morning, today you had, or I should say yesterday when the time of this podcast was released, so on Monday, you did have kind of like post week 18 takeaways that you had after this weekend's game. So we'll get into the games. Let me know what you kind of took away from these matches, and we can kind of roll through these here in kind of rapid fire format. But we'll start off here with the only match on Friday. Utah Warriors taking on the RFC Los Angeles. Yeah, real fun match, back and forth affair for the most part. I had picked Utah. They didn't come through for me. Again, I think they still had the offensive firepower that you're kind of leaving yourself at the end of the season. Like, what if? Like, if they had McEnany, if they had Manson, if they had Mono for the entire year, like, what could have happened? But give credit to RFC Los Angeles, who came through with the win, 31-24. Just thoughts on this match here to open up the Week 18 matches.
Friday Night Rugby is always fun. What a shootout too. I mean, that thing was back and forth there in the first half. Things slowed down a little bit in the second, but to your point, what could have been for Utah, right? Had that back line, that back 3 stayed healthy, and great for LA to end their inaugural season on a win. I think the coolest part of that game was it was played at America's First Field, so where Utah Warriors used to play in years past. Almost 11,000 fans attended that match. There were 10,900 fans at that match. Wow. That's awesome. Keep that up. Utah, they always come out and support their club, but that's really cool to see.
And to put things into perspective, it's funny how we talk about fans, not to give myself a plug or anything, but I had just recently covered the Calder Cup. The Hershey Bears set a arena record at 11,013 for the
Mm,
Game 6 Calder Cup final. The
yeah.
fact that we're even close to that
Yeah.
is pretty crazy.
It is.
10,900 fans for a regular season match,
Yeah.
not even playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
That's reassuring. And
Pretty
that's a
good.
positive sign for, yeah, pretty good. But yeah, nice shootout here. Again, leaving yourself what if Mono, McKinney, Manson combined for over, if I'm doing quick maths here, um
A lot of points.
50 points, more than 50 points. You got 18.2 for Joe Mono,
Yeah.
Caleb McEnany, 18.1, Michael Manson, 15.9, which is pretty crazy to see. Dylan Nell
He
was back in the
returned.
lineup.
Yeah.
Not fantasy relevant, but again, I think this is a
I
guy
had him
that's
in the
definitely
weekly
going to be
challenge.
this is definitely going to be a guy that will be on people's radar heading into the drafts next year, but he returns in good form from a fantasy perspective, 15.2 with 65 meters gained, 14 tackles, and the
Mm-hmm.
full 80 played. And then looking at RFCLA's kind of side of things, Ben Strang, with the dominance that he had
Yeah.
with the couple tries. And then we got to mention this guy's name because I feel like we mentioned it every freaking week. Semi Kunatani.
Oh,
I
stud.
mean,
Look at those
he,
numbers.
is he going to be the number one back rower off the board next year? He might be.
I mean, yeah, he might even go top 3,
Like,
top 2, maybe.
crazy
Yeah.
to think. But
Yeah.
yeah, Semi Kunatani finishes
Just
off at
that
13.7
consistent
fantasy
that
points.
consistent production where you're
Double
look,
digit fantasy
yeah,
points every single week,
15,
even when
16
he was
points on
coming off,
average.
even if he was coming off the bench,
Even
except
he
for
was getting
rounds
yellow
1 and 2.
cards. Even
Even when he's
even
getting yellow cards. So for the 4 matches he got yellow cards in, he still had double digit fantasy points in all of them. Like you would think the single digit ones would come with the ones with the yellow cards. Actually, the single digit ones did not come with the ones with the yellow card games, which is pretty crazy to think about. I believe on the season, he finishes off as the number 3 player overall, which is
Mm,
pretty crazy to think.
yeah.
But yeah. Utah, RFC Los Angeles. What a way to end off with a bang there. Pretty cool stuff. All right, let's go on to, and we're not going to spend too much time on this one because this was just a barn burner.
Yeah.
Dominant. We talked about this on the Glorious Rugby podcast. It do I need to say I told you so?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we all knew that. Yeah,
It turned out to be exactly what we thought it was going to be. Both of us were kind of saying we're trying to find ways to maybe figure out how Anthem was going to win this one,
yeah.
but it played out exactly how I thought it was going to play out. New England Free Jacks win this one dominantly, 40-7. I don't think Anthem scored their only try of the game until like the latter
Yeah.
portion of the match. Again, don't need to touch too much
But
on
no,
this.
Ryan, the coolest part of that match was the simple fact that Wayne Vanderbank's kicking to himself try, right?
Yes.
Made the Sports Center top, was number
That was
3
the
on
cool
top
thing.
10.
That was cool. Very
Really
cool. And we'd love to see that type of exposure.
Exactly.
Speaking of Wayne Vanderbank, 23 fantasy points on that one.
Stud.
Who would have thought? Right, this is another surprise that kind of comes through, and you're going to get used to this if you listen to this podcast. That like there are always going to be surprises here in the world of fantasy MLR because that's just the way it goes, and guys are just going to come out of nowhere. Last year we had Joe Mono. This year we
Michael
had
Manson,
Semi Kunatani, Michael Manson, and everyone thought it was going to be LaRue Milan or Ben Lesage, and Wayne Vanderbank comes here and does crazy things from a fantasy perspective. Double-digit fantasy points once again every single match he's played except for 2, which is crazy to think about. A season high of 28.9 in round 7. Finishes off just above the 200-point mark, which is cool to see, and finishes off as your 6th best fantasy player in the fantasy MLR season, which is crazy to think about because he was a guy that was getting drafted in mid rounds, if not later, in this one. But other guys on the Free Jacks, I mean, when you score 40 points, you're gonna have a whole bunch of guys on that side. They're gonna score a lot. Jason Potros, 18.2. Paul Bellicana has been a kind of a disappointment this fantasy season, but he gets 16.2. Quatrin with the 2 tries, he scored 14.4. And Seta Baker back in the lineup, 13.2. Really on the Anthem side, only really 2 guys that kind of were relevant. Junior Gaffa, 14. When he's in the lineup, he's
Good
solid
player.
for you.
Yeah.
And Terengatir Waitokia, 12.9 for
year.
him, who another great year. And despite being on the Anthem, like, I mean, another guy that you're probably going to think there is going to be drafted in the top 5 because finishes off as the 2nd best player. I picked him up off waivers.
Dude, he
this
carried
season.
you for a lot of weeks, man. He was putting up some big numbers.
He
Him
ended
and
up being
Lobster.
A lock in my lineup, which is crazy, which is a kind of a sentiment that my brother and I have talked about on this show before, is that Anthem is fantasy relevant. Like they score point, not in this one because they only put up 7 points, but for a majority of the season, they've been pretty solid. All right, let's shift on over to the 3rd match of the weekend. The Chicago Hounds taking on the Miami Sharks. This was another one that was kind of You know, Miami come in. I think did Chicago go out of front or Miami went out of front, and then Chicago kind of came through there. They end
Mhm.
up taking it 38-26. Thoughts on the Hounds versus the Sharks?
Congrats on Miami on a pretty successful inaugural season, right? They didn't get eliminated from playoff contention until the second to last weekend. They beat Old Glory DC, but because Old Glory lost by less than 7, they got the bonus point enough
Hmm.
to lock up the playoffs, right? So
Yeah.
Miami in it all the way through. You know, certainly some fun, interesting names that they had, right? Ben Bonasso, Manuel Ardao. He was one of my studs throughout the year that
Hmm.
carried me. Great fantasy performance. You had other guys that would come in, and Nick Gregg, the center, scored, quite a few times. So they were certainly pieces there. Chicago needed to win this game to make sure that Old Glory didn't leapfrog them in the standings, and Chicago went out and did what they were supposed to do, right? So congrats to Chicago. Second season now. They've in their second season in MLR, they've now qualified for the playoffs. So that's good news for them. They're going to take on NOLA Gold. That's going to be fun. We'll talk about the playoffs here in a second. But I got to say, I do want to shout out a little bit Luke Hardy, because I think earlier in the season he took some criticism for
Hmm.
maybe some underperformance, particularly maybe at fly half. I don't know if it's because the USA Men's Eagles, they've got their 2 international matches coming up in July, but it seems like Luke, at least in the last 2 to 3 games, and you can go look at his fantasy numbers here, has had pretty steady performances. I'm not
I
saying it's a
think
redemption. I also think it's like Scott Lawrence saying, "Hey, Chicago, you need to put Cardi at 10 a little bit more because I need to see some stuff here." But if you look at his numbers, steady and wins. Like Chicago was on a 4-game losing streak, and then they closed out, I think, on a 3-game winning streak. So
I think to that point, Fitzy, I think Chicago finishes. Obviously, we can talk about the experiment that was for the first 3 or 4 weeks when they had Billy Meeks at 10.
yeah.
But I think this team is at its best, and Matt has been on the record on this show before saying this. All you need for this Chicago team, with the talent that they have, with Billy Meeks, with Nate Oxberger,
Mhm.
with Mark O'Keefe, with
Noah
Carls,
Brown and Julian
Noah
Dominguez.
Brown.
Yeah.
All you need at 10 is a distributor.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't need a guy that needs to do it all,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
all Luke Hart needs to do is catch the ball, pass the ball, right? Draw a guy past the ball, right? Let Billy Meeks on your left or right do that playmaking, right? All
Mhm.
you got to do is draw on a defender, bring it out. If Chicago goes the entire season with Luke Hardy at 10, I think this is a much different, and even I shouldn't say much different, an even better year than what they
Mhm.
had this season. And
Yeah.
you can say it's a success. They make the playoffs, they're there.
Yeah.
But I think that Carl's is it's more of a Carl's thing than a Cardi thing, because I think Carl's is so much more deadly at the 15 position than he is
Mhm.
with his kicking ability, with Carl's kicking ability, and with his ability to attack. I didn't like that being muted when he was at the 10 position. So
Yeah.
all I said was
Mhm.
that, and what Maddie says, that you want to distribute it. But let's get into some of the
Yep.
fantasy performances here. Like you mentioned, Luke Hardy had a good game, interception on that one, I believe. Interception, I think it was.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
17.3 fantasy points with the 70 meters gained. Some other guys on Chicago, Julian Dominguez. Nice to see him kind of pull through here. He's had a nice solid finish to the season
Yeah.
with
Ryan,
18.7 in
if you
this one.
sorry to interrupt, but Dominguez, I had him on my roster last year in the championship game. I did not
Yeah.
start him against
You were making them. I say, see,
and he had a big game. He had a monster game.
that's the live and learn. You do
He
you
shows up in
that
big
playoff
games. He
experience,
knows.
right? You to everyone in all the major sports, you talk about that experience in the biggest lights, and you didn't falter here. You made those decisions that you learned from.
Yeah, I
Other
almost didn't
guys,
start
Dylan.
Michael Manson. Like, come on, that's crazy.
Yeah. Dylan Fawcett, I mean, the butcher doing the butcher things, 13.1, had 2 tries in this one. He'll be another guy
Yeah,
that will be off the boards again. Had kind of a down performances like
but picked it up
through and
there,
through,
Dan.
but
Yeah.
picked it up at the end and had some big times that you're
Oh
not
yeah.
typically going to get from a front row position. On the Miami side, Nick Rigg, 16.9. He had a very good game. Manuel Ardeo when he's not getting cards, and this one he did not.
But look at his numbers, though. I
Numerically.
mean, like for the most part, outside of a couple here and there, I mean, he was.
Very, very
Yeah.
semi Kunitani-esque, right?
Mm.
If Manuel Ardeo doesn't get that suspension midway through the season, I think we're talking about him as one of the top tier back rowers in the fantasy
Look
circles,
at
and
it. Look at
very
his
similar
numbers
to
on the steals, like 4, 4, 5. Like
crazy.
those are you're getting points when he
Hmm.
jackals the ball. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
and it is quite amazing. And then last guy, Marcos Young, 9.9 for him, not too bad. All right. Let's move on to the fourth matchup of the weekend. We got Old Glory DC, your boys, taking on the NOLA
Yeah.
Gold. Obviously, heading into this one, we talked about this on the Glorious Rugby podcast, Fits, that NOLA, I guess, knew going into it that they weren't going to have a shot at taking that Eastern
Mm-hmm.
Conference title. I don't think I saw necessarily a weakened lineup to the extent that you would maybe expect. I think this was a good test for Old Glory DC. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
you discount this win in any
Mm-mm.
way.
Yeah.
I think it's a solid one for Old Glory DC 27-24. And now, you have some positive optimism and momentum here heading into this break, heading into the playoffs when you're gonna have to take on New England.
I thought we nailed the score for the most part on the NOLA
Right?
game. I
Didn't
think,
we?
yeah, I think
Now that I think
we
back on it.
yeah, I think
Yeah, we said
we were
high to
pretty
mid
good.
20s, the
Yeah.
close game by 3. Yeah, I think that's good. Too bad I didn't bet on it, but we'll get into that anyways. No.
The only thing that had me a little concerned was that Axel Muller, who's one of your boys, he came off early in the game. Of course, we've got 3 weeks for him to get healthy and heal up for whatever um, happened there. But it was good to see Martin Vaca back, right? Like he was
Mm-hmm.
out for a
Mm-hmm.
bit. He came out. Man, that guy plays hard. He was getting banged up in the game. He's certainly not 100%, but yeah, it was good to see some pieces back. Hopefully, Axel will be all right and he continue to be a fantasy because he's a difference maker out there on the wing.
As an Old Glory DC fan, does this install how much confidence does this win install for you heading into the playoffs? I mean, I think for me, and I'll kind of toss it to you, is that a loss here would have just kind of would have kind of just like dampered all of that confidence heading into the playoffs. And I think especially for a team like Old Glory DC. What's up, buddy? Making a little appearance?
Yeah, he
Why don't
can't.
you
I got
introduce
the
to the
headphones
people?
in. This
Ah,
is
there
Rory.
you go.
Rory, say hi.
Hi.
Hey, Rory, how did your U8 tournament go over the weekend?
Good.
Yeah.
And I guess Royce is
Four.
gonna be the Royce is gonna be one of the next Old Glory DC guys here. You
He's a
wait
Houston
till Old Glory
Sabercats
DC.
fan.
What?
Yeah, he loves the Sabercats.
Oh goodness.
Can you guys go?
There's
Can you guys
there's
go
some
back in the
problem
kitchen?
there.
I'll be over there in a
But
little bit. Okay. Okay. Sorry, we got one more visitor here. Say hi, Kelly.
there you go. A
Thank you,
visit
Kelly.
from the whole Fitzpatrick family. It's
We
great.
got one more, but she doesn't want to get on the mic.
There you
3
go.
kiddos. Thank you, kids.
But what I was saying though,
Oh
outside
yeah.
of
So yeah. I
star
think
star player Royce before he gets into the lineup, I think this installs a lot more confidence for Old Glory DC than what a loss would have.
yeah, because you got to look at NOLA Gold. I mean, they beat New England a couple of weeks before. DC most recently when they played New England, they lost by 1 point. Yeah, they did go up to New England earlier in the year and beat them. I don't think this is the same New England team that it was the last year, right? Is New England still the favorite in the Eastern Conference? Probably, but I think that gap is a little bit narrower, right? Like I think NOLA can give them a good run. I think OGDC has proven in the 2 games that they played them where the winner only won by 1 each time. Yeah, it'll be a little different because it's up there because it's the playoffs, but I think you got to give Old Glory DC a puncher's chance in this.
Yeah.
And I'm excited. I'm chomping at the bit for Old Glory to go up there and knock out, the defending champs. That would certainly shock a lot of people, but I don't think it would shock the boys in that Old Glory DC locker room. I can tell you that.
Well, we'll get into those kind of early playoff kind of thoughts heading into in just a couple minutes here. But just wanted to get fantasy players out of the way here.
Yeah.
Jonah Moe, 18.4 fantasy points. If he's healthy all season long, again, there are a handful of guys. Like, look at those numbers. Like a handful of guys that we're talking about, and I'm talking about guys like Semi Kunatani,
Mhm.
Manuel Ardeo. Jonah Moe is right up there.
Yeah.
18.4, 17 tackles, 3 breakdown steals in this.
I tried
one.
to trade
Pretty
for him, but
solid.
Maddie wouldn't go for it.
No, and he's his rare player on OVALYe too. He has a special spot for Jonah Moe, and I will say a special spot for this NOLA Gold team too. But that's for a conversation for a later time. Other NOLA Gold guys, 13.8 for Jordan Jackson Hope. Kind of a similar situation to the Wayne Vanderbank situation where you thought it was going to be JP Duplessis, but it ended up being Jordan Jackson Hope that really kind of pulled through. He wasn't necessarily kind of trickled off towards the end there, but picked it up in the last few weeks. But in that middling kind of time, he also dealt with some injury stuff too. He was kind of average, but Jordan Jackson Hope definitely did better than Duplessis this season. And then Taniela Filimone, 13.4 fantasy points for him. and he just turned on the Jets on that try too. Like that one was really really cool to see. Old Glory DC side, Perry Humphreys 18.2, a guy that was kind of like you
Yeah,
know,
just obviously his best game for Old Glory. I mean,
right,
first time he scored for Old Glory, and I think he was banged up, a little bit injured, new into the squad, but
right,
yeah,
right. Looks solid.
yeah,
And then Damian Hoyland, 13 fantasy points for him, and then
consistent.
Jason Robertson,
You
12.8.
you know what you're going to get out of Hoyland there in the fullback
Right.
position. You're going to get some meters gained.
Exactly. All right. Let's shift on now over to the second last matchup. The Houston Sabercats at home taking on the Dallas Jackals in
Yeah,
the Texas Cup or whatever you call it. Um, Winning on a Davy Coates kick at the end,
yeah,
29-28. Really don't need to say much in this one because I think it looks a lot closer on face value than what it is. But Dallas, you just when you're facing a team like the Houston Sabercats, you cannot allow them to score the first, what is it, 3 tries of the match. Like I think it was like Houston was up, and by then it's just too late. And yes, you
yeah.
got the lead back, but it's just you the whole time you're just playing on your back foot and you're playing on your heels, trying to crawl yourselves back. And it doesn't take much. I mean, what a deflator for Dallas Jackals fans. You had it right there in your grasp.
Mm.
I get it. It may not have been the top Houston Sabercats lineup, but it still was a good Houston Sabercats lineup. But it was close. It was close. I mean, kudos to Dallas to claw their way back in it. But again, when I was watching the highlights and watching this match, as soon as Houston went up 21, I was like, no matter how the rest of the game plays out, even as Dallas was starting to crawl their way back into it, I was like, Houston's still going to find a way to win this one at the end, just because you can't give a team that's been the best all season long that type of edge.
Yeah, they just seem like a cool, steady team that does not get flustered.
Mhm.
They know their style of rugby they want to play. Yeah, and when they trot out that full 15, man, it's going to be a physical game. It's going to be an intense game. And if it's down in Houston, it's going to be hot. It's going to be humid. It's Texas
Yeah.
rugby. I mean, it's exciting. You know, yeah, Dallas been great for them to end the season on a win, but they've got nothing to be ashamed of in that game. And I'm sure they're chomping at the bit when they see them again in 3 weeks. It's
And
going to be a fun match. It's going to be
right.
two
And I
contrasting
think
styles.
you learn a lot, right? Because you're like, okay, we can't do what we did in that last time we played them when you're heading into that semifinal
Hmm.
match, obviously. But I think there's also some optimism to be taken away here because you're like, hey, you know what? Like, we can keep up with this team. Like, we had the win in our hands. And
Hmm.
again, I get it. Wasn't the top Houston Sabercats lineup. Again, wasn't far from it. But this does
Yeah.
instill some sort of
Yeah, yeah.
confidence for the Dallas Jackals heading into this one. Solid fantasy points scored in this one as well. Ben Fry,
Yeah.
he's really turned it up for the Dallas Jackals for the past couple weeks. I mean, if you had this guy in your fantasy playoffs, you were running. I don't know how many people had Ben
I
Fry
had him in the
in their
weekly
fantasy lineup.
challenge.
Okay, there you go. 22.4 in round 17, then backs it up here this past week, 18.8
Hmm.
with the try assist, and 10 tackles. You got Thomas Kubia
Yeah. Solid.
playing well, 18.3 fantasy points for him. Thomas Milano's 13.4. And then from the Houston side, Davy Kutzer, 16.2. He was a blast to own this week, this season. And then
Yeah.
12 Tassi, 10.5 fantasy points for him. So yeah, pretty solid match there, especially from the fantasy circles. We'll wrap up with this last match here. San Diego Legion taking on the Seattle Seawolves at home. Seattle kind of going up front early, right? San Diego fighting their way back and end up taking this one
Yeah.
45-33, which is interesting because again, I think there is a lot of kind of pause with this San Diego team. They haven't looked great at times, but they have been winning as of late. They're a dangerous team heading into playoffs, have that momentum, and they continue that here in Seattle, or they continue this against Seattle, and then now in this into the playoffs, they're on a roll here.
Yeah, even with Seattle not having their full strength squad, I mean, they still had Mac Mason out there. They still had JP
Mhm.
Smith out there. They still had Devon Rousseau out there. I mean, like Foodie, like
Like I
they,
tried. I try to convince myself, right, Fitzy? I'm like, oh, okay, maybe this wasn't as strong. You see Ryan Reese in the lineup, and you're like, okay, maybe it wasn't their top guys, but it was still
yeah.
pretty top tier, right? To your point.
Yeah, I think surprised and maybe impressed by how San Diego played. And it's funny if you I go back to an email that I sent out on December 31st of 2023 where I made my superlatives or predictions for 2024, and this was before they reshuffled. Remember back then it was
Hmm.
only going to be one. It was going to be one conference with 11
Right.
teams in it, and I predicted that the San Diego Legion would beat the Houston Sabercats in the MLR Shield. I still feel pretty good about both those teams like getting as far as they will. I think this is probably one of the best performances we've seen from San Diego. Again, it's still against a strong, steady side in Seattle. So, and guess what? I'm pretty sure we're going to see this matchup again in
Yeah,
3 weeks, which is
Which
crazy.
which is funny to think that the way that you ended the round 18, the last week of the regular season, is the exact way that you're going to see the next match, and that just adds so many more storylines and just so much more
Yeah.
strategy. Again, it'll be fun to compare kind of what the teams put out this week to predicting what the teams are going to put out the next coming weeks, which will be interesting. But a fantasy perspective, had big time performances. 30.1 from Devon Rousseau. Again, another guy, if he stays in the league, he's going to be a top tier
Yep.
guy that's picked off of the board.
I think my best
Was
draft pick. My best draft pick.
yeah, easily. Well, you remember earlier in the season when I tried to trade him for you, right? And it
like,
was close. I mean, realistically, how close were you to taking that? It was a fair deal at the
It
time.
was. Yeah.
It was what? Billy Meeks and Axel Muller
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
Devon
Yeah.
Rousseau.
I almost did it, but he's just so steady. Such a top notch.
And that just goes to show you how much
And he
value
also had that
has.
center back 3 flexibility too. And I was like, I don't know if I can part with that.
Yeah. And he had again finishes off the season on a high note here against San Diego. Other Seattle guys, Duncan Matthews had a pretty good match.
Yep.
Good to see him back in the line, 16.4. And then Manate Akui guy, 16.3 for him. He looked pretty solid. And then looking on the San Diego side, 30.1 for Philemon Wakanabete.
Mm-hmm.
Said that right?
I think so. What kind of bet? Yeah, I think you nailed it.
He that was a scorcher they had. Mikey Teo had a pretty solid match with 16.4, and then Blair Cowan. He was actually distributing the ball quite well.
Yeah, he was.
For back row guy, 15.3 fantasy points for him.
So real quickly, look who had 16 points in that game. Who was number 1 overall, or 15.1 points.
15.1. Number 1 overall
for San Diego, back 3. You'll find it.
Thomas Awake.
Yeah, he was number 1 overall draft pick in the OG league.
Was he really?
Yeah, he was.
Huh.
Yeah.
I completely forgot about that.
Yeah, how crazy is that?
I mean, I hyped him up. I will say.
He had a solid year.
He had a solid year last year. I thought San Diego might have said, but I think Matty nailed it on the head when he said the loss of Richard Judd is going to show this season in terms of the offense. And he ended up being right. Definitely not the same explosiveness. But yeah, Thomas Awake, 15.1 in this one. Doesn't have as great of a season as he has a solid season, but not as great as we would have predicted.
Yeah.
But yeah, what a fun round 18 to round out the 2024 Major League Rugby regular season. Let's quickly hear Fitzy. Let's just start getting into some just thoughts here to end the season. We'll start it off with kind of season thoughts. I mean, the 2024 year, exciting one, big names. I honestly think this is the best Major League Rugby season that we've had ever in the league's history. And that's not a superlative. Like, I don't think I'm over exaggerating, especially when you take into account all the turmoil that this league went through so close to the beginning of the season, losing the Arrows, losing New York, moving Atlanta. I think, man, all I can do is give kudos to this league and the teams because they put on some exciting rugby this year. And we've seen we had some fun matches just to kind of put a bow on what the 2024 Major League Rugby season. We'll have all off season to talk about it, but I just wanted to get that part out there because I think we had a stellar 2024 year.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, the Dallas Jackals, who've been doormats since they've come into the league, made the playoffs. Like, fun to cheer for and like fun to watch. Like, who didn't have fun watching the Dallas Jackals, run up a bunch of points and try and hold off other teams from scoring on them. The Miami Sharks were competitive. The Chicago Hounds made the playoffs in their second season. The RFCLA was competitive in matches, and you had Semi Kunatani, running havoc on people, and you had San Diego and Seattle renew their rivalry, and now Seattle and Houston with this budding rivalry, and New England and Old Glory DC playing tough physical matches. I thought it was a very fun and entertaining year for Major League Rugby. Again, given all of the concerns and the turmoil and Anthem. Like, I know Anthem didn't win any games this year, and they took a couple of teams almost to the wire there, but the experiment, I love the concept behind it. Be interesting to see how that team will stay together, if it's going to always change, and what does that look like for their record. But it's been I thought I was pleasantly surprised by some of the players for Anthem And the hope again is that those players are then going to be able to
Hmm.
make the men's Eagles roster squad in 2027 and 31. So TBD, but across the board, I mean, I know expectations, they succeeded expectations this season.
Yeah, no question about that. So then let's then shift over the conversation, Fitzy, to a fantasy MLR kind of takeaway this year. I thought, and Cohen, in line with how the MLR season went, this was a blast. And I'll kind of just, we'll use this portion to kind of just thank all of our league members that joined, that tested out. This was the first time that we opened up to the public. Fitzy, you've been with us since day one. You were there for the spreadsheet days. You're now here with the website days, where we've kind of
Yeah.
grown a little bit and advanced ourselves, especially with the help
Kudos
of Alistair
AKP. Shout out
Kirschpool. Yep.
AKP.
Exactly. With the help of Alistair Kirschpool, our website guru, we've expanded our analytics. We have our stats guy, our analytics guy, Nick Johnson, who's also a
Yeah.
commissioner of one of the leagues. We're growing quickly, and this was a huge monumental step for us to open this up, give people a go at it for the first time. There's still a lot to improve, a lot to learn from. And I've mentioned on shows before, we're going to send out a kind of a feedback Google questionnaire for our league members to fill out, give any ideas, feedback, questions, things like that, so that we can improve and continue getting better moving forward. But I thought this, and I probably can say this for AKP and Matt and Vandy, I don't think this season, the first open up to the public, could have gone any better. There really were no hiccups, major problems. There were
Mhm.
some along the way that we got resolved quickly. But man, what a fun fantasy season. And it was a really cool experience to see other people enjoying what you and I've got to
Yeah.
experience for such a while.
The fact that you opened it up for others outside to dip their toes into fantasy with the weekly challenge, super cool. Give people an easy to understand concept of how this all works. A couple more flowers to be handed out here. Obviously, AKP for all the behind the
Hmm.
scenes stuff. You, of course, for all the behind the scenes stuff, and you and Maddie and Vandy doing this show week after week without fail. I mean, you were the Danny Tusitala until a couple of weeks ago when you
Yeah,
decided that,
there
you
you
had to
go.
go
Yeah,
chase the
honestly.
Hershey Bears to the Calder Cup.
Yeah.
But no, seriously, year one was fun and exciting because it was new, right? And there were growing pains, but like we knew it was going to take 4 or 5 days to get results, but we were also kind of tracking it. But we knew like you were scoring by hand. Year two, it got a little bit bigger. There was some modification, things were coming quicker. This year, with the fact that and some weekends before the Sunday games, we had some early results already. So you kind of had an idea of where things stood. Night and day, so much more efficient, so much fun. I mean, the fun has just gotten better each year. That
Hmm.
I'm looking forward to this next year just to see how many more leagues form and just how further you guys can take this, right? I know we're getting attention from certain folks. We know that fantasy has been a boon for other sports leagues. Like it's time for Major League Rugby to be like, you know what? We got to figure something out with these fantasy Ruckers guys. They got the media thing down. They've got people's attention. We've got fun content. It's a concept that people understand. It can be a sponsored element. Like everything lines up. What more
Yeah.
do you need?
What can I say? What can I say? We've worked hard
What more do you need?
to make this thing grow, but I
We just
appreciate
need
Fitzy
match day
adding that.
23s to come out on a consistent basis.
That honestly, that's probably the one thing that we need to, yeah, exactly, to focus on. We would greatly appreciate, but yeah, I think to finish it off, gonna continue getting better. We're gonna be here for the long run, and we can't wait to give fantasy MLR to more and more people moving forward. So a little bit of an early shout out, but hey, if you're interested in playing fantasy MLR, reach out to us. Sign up for a season next year. That will keep you in the know at the Fantasy Ruckers. And you'll be able to, let's expand this thing. We had 40 members this year. We have, I think, almost 100 people on our Discord, almost 100 people subscribed to our YouTube channel. A whole bunch, subscribe to our podcast. Let's continue to grow this thing, and let's make fantasy MLR a staple of the league and make that jump that Fitzy's talking about. All right, we'll wrap up our segment here, Fitzy, with you, just with a little bit of a quick playoff kind of chat here and just early playoff thoughts. I know we're a few weeks away. We got the international break, got some fun international test series coming up. I know you are going to DC to watch the U.S. Eagles play Scotland, which will be fun.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about some early thoughts. We have the matchups now officially. Again, we talked about how there's going to be rematches in a
Yeah.
few weeks' time between Houston and Dallas, Seattle and San Diego in that Western Conference. And then the Eastern Conference, we've got New England, DC, NOLA, Chicago. Not going to put ourselves on the spot to kind of predict the way that this bracket is going to go. But teams that you like going in the playoffs, teams that you don't like, where is the confidence level in this? What are your kind of overall arching thoughts on the 2024 playoff picture?
Yeah, I think a lot of this will depend on how players, just the health of the men's Eagles, right, that have left their MLR clubs and are training with the men's Eagles for the July 5th match or July 6th, 5th or 6th match, July 5th match in Chicago against Romania, and then July 12th in DC against Scotland, right? There are a number of players from MLR clubs, right? Obviously, that's an obvious statement. So can those guys, sorry, can those guys stay healthy and be fit, knowing that, that game in DC is on Friday, July 12th? They've got 8 days to turn around for a few of the guys, 9 for others, to then step in and play, a physical semifinal match. So hopefully no injuries, right? Because that'll change things. And some of these teams have had more men's Eagles than others, like DC there, right? They got Tommaso Boni, Jack Ascaro. Those are 2, and they got a couple other guys on, Jamison Fano Schultz. You got a couple other guys on the training squad. That'll be something to take a look at. Houston has 1, Christian Dyer. Dallas, obviously, with Sam Gala. JP Smith, I think Seattle, he might actually be slotting in at scrum half there. San Diego, I don't know if they're affected too much. Greg Peterson, New England's got some Canadians because they're a Canadian squad, so we can talk about Canada, right? So, and, obviously, NOLA and Chicago have a few, right? I think if you look at the Western Conference right now, it's hard for me to support an argument that doesn't have Houston and Seattle meeting in the Western Conference final. Could San Diego surprise a lot of folks and beat Seattle? Very real possibility. But I think a Houston-Seattle, each time they've played this year, it's been a fun match. I think a Western Conference final between those two would be stellar. In the Eastern Conference, or I'll let you comment on the Western Conference on my thoughts there. Go.
No. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, it's hard to bet. I wouldn't even throw necessarily Seattle in there. I think the confidence level and the disparity between where Houston is at right now versus everyone else in the Western Conference. Um, I don't want to be on the record with this, but I would bet my house on Houston making it to the final. I mean, I'm just that confident in this team, and I think that their level of play is just so much superior than everyone else. But nonetheless, we've seen crazier things happen in the MLR playoffs before. But I mean, I don't recall. I get New England went on that run last year, and they did not end up winning. But I feel so much more confident with this Houston Sabercats team, especially with the way that they've played at times. It just feels like this team is unbeatable at some points, even when they're having bad games. It'll be interesting to see on the Western Conference. Eastern Conference side, that's where we kind of get a little bit interesting. My confidence, every single team on this Eastern Conference bracket, like I have a problem with. There's nothing in there that I'm like 100. There's no Houston, right? Like in this one. Like I know last year we kind of had that where on the West, San Diego was pretty like much like, okay, like this team is gonna, and then New England, we're like, okay, like this team's probably gonna be making it. But on the Eastern Conference side, I can really see any scenario happening. I can see an upset with DC. I can see an upset with Chicago. Surprisingly, I think the team that I'm least confident in is NOLA, to be honest. Because they're the one team that just I don't know what to expect on a week in and week out basis. But your thoughts on the Eastern Conference?
Yeah, if you look at this, I think New England's the favorite. They're going to be at home. It's going to be a tough place to play there at Veterans Memorial Stadium. But this is a New England squad, that has lost to DC this year, that has lost to NOLA this year, that has lost to Chicago this year. They've lost to every team in the Eastern Conference this year. They didn't lose, I think, a home game at all last year, and they lost a number of them this year. Still a good squad, right? They played DC twice this year. DC went up there and beat them by 1. They came down here to DC. New England won by 1. I think this could be a really fun match. And I really do think DC has a shot at winning that game there. DC wins that game. That obviously opens everything up. The team that I think NOLA's got a real good shot against Chicago. I think NOLA probably wins the game against Chicago. Chicago's the team where I think NOLA's just better. I think they're just playing better. That I really do see I can see it. I know this is crazy. I can see a DC NOLA Eastern Conference Championship.
which would
How
be
wild would that be?
interesting.
Which would be
That
in
would
New
be
Orleans. It wouldn't even be in DC, right? Because NOLA,
right,
the higher seed,
right.
would host it. But I can see DC going up there and knocking off the defending MLR champions.
Well, for your DC boys, the pathway is through the road because of
Yeah,
being that lowest seed. So they'll
that's all
have to
right.
win on the
They
road throughout
know
the way.
they know
We'll
what's
see what
ahead of
happens.
them.
Before we wrap it up here, Fitzy, I'm gonna leave you with one question. I'm not gonna tell the people that you're locking it in. We're still weeks away and we don't know where
Yeah.
injuries are. We'll have our episode where we give our final bracket predictions. But if I had
Mhm.
to ask you the question, who do you think is your early pick to win the shield right now? If you're the most confident in, right? If I
Mhm.
said you were betting, you know, your life savings on this team, who would you put your money on? And then the second follow-up question is if you have kind of a sneaky favorite, a
Mhm.
sneaky team that you could picture winning it, who would that be? So give me your
Mhm.
answers there and I'll give you mine.
Well, I think both those teams may be in the same conference. So
Okay.
that latter question, that might be difficult to answer. If I had to put a bet on any single one team, I want to say Houston. I think they're the favorite,
It's
but
hard to say it because
yeah.
it's like the easy answer, right? Like everyone is going to say Houston, but that's why I have the
But there's
follow-up
something
question
about
with your team.
Seattle. There's something about Seattle
I don't
that
know. It feels
I
different.
just
Feels
like
different with
I just
Seattle.
like even given all the turmoil and some changes this year. There's something about Seattle where, if I put a $25 wager down on Seattle, why not? Let's let it ride. And I
All
think
right.
it could go well.
So your favorite is you got to lock it in.
Favorite's probably Houston.
Okay.
Houston's my
And then
favorite. Houston's the favorite.
who's your kind of team that you could picture winning it that people wouldn't think of?
Your old glory DC
No, I knew
boys.
you were gonna say you. I knew you were gonna say it. I knew you were gonna. I shouldn't have asked the question.
Look,
I think
look.
the Eastern Conference is wide open,
Yeah,
right? And I
you
think
can't
that's
you
what
can't
gives.
tell me New England fans can't say, "Oh, it's going to be a shoe in for New England." DC beat New England by 1 point up there. New England came down here and beat DC by 1 point. These two teams are closer than you think. They
Yeah.
really are. It's going
And
to
I
be an
think there's
intense
the
match.
there's the recency bias too. Like New England just coming off the championship, a lot of people have a lot of confidence in this New England team. But you're right. There is that possibility there.
We'll
And
see.
again,
We'll see if
it
all of the men's Eagles that come back to the DC squad are healthy, and also the Canadians that leave New England and come back if they're healthy. If there's some injuries, that may change things a little bit. But I think that's going to be. I think it's going to come down to a 1 or 2 point.
really what makes the Eastern Conference so interesting. And my team, so my favorite is Houston as well, right? If
Yeah.
I had to put my life savings on it, I think everyone's choosing Houston. Um, I'll tease a little bit who my kind of underlying sneaky pick is. It's coming out of the Eastern Conference for one reason, because to
Mm,
your point, it feels like anything can happen in this Eastern Conference. It really, really does. And all it takes is one upset for you to kind of find an easy, like not an easy, but like a straightforward pathway to the final. And if you make the final, you make the Shield Championship, like you have a shot at winning, no matter what team is in there. You know what I mean? Even if it's Houston versus DC, to what you're saying at the end, there's a shot. I mean, you just got to make the game and then you play the 80 minutes and you see where the chips
hmm
fall. For me, I actually think it's Chicago.
mm,
And I like the players that are on Chicago. The storyline, Sam Harris just left, right? You're starting to roll with a few of your players. You're starting to establish it. Luke Hardy at 10, you looked good against Miami. You were able to score points. I don't know what to expect out of NOLA. And if DC comes out with an upset win to New England, kind of what I'm saying, there is a straightforward path to getting to thing. I think it's funny. I do think for that to happen, DC needs to beat New England because I think DC has a better shot at beating New England than Chicago has a better shot at beating New England just
mm,
because of the way they play. But if it ends up being a DC Chicago conference final in the
mm.
East, I mean, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. That's what I gotta say. But hey, that was a fun episode, Fitzy. That was great. Gonna do a couple more segments, but wanted to let you go here. Just with on that note, on a positive note of you cheering for your DC boys. I wanted to wrap it up with just how great it is for you to finally get your win. As hard it is for me to say that your championship win. Got your jersey here. We'll get that out to charity.
I'm excited.
Follow at Rugby Morning for all your daily digest
Yeah,
of rugby content. We've been appreciative of your partnership with us in terms of being in part of our league, me hopping on your guys' Glorious Rugby podcast,
absolutely.
pushing our content and everything like that. So yeah, give Fitzpatrick a follow at Rugby Morning. email, all that good stuff, man. And we're just glad that you've been a part of this journey for as long as you have.
On to year 4, but first we've got to do the playoffs weekly challenge. I'm excited for that, and hopefully we get a bunch of new people come in and join, so
Yeah,
they can get their first
absolutely.
taste of what fantasy MLR is all about.
Yep. And keep a lookout for that. Announcements on that will be coming out as we get closer to playoffs. League members, keep an eye out for that feedback Google questionnaire. But until then, Fitzy, thank you for joining us, man, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ryan.
And now it is time for our final 2 segments of the show. Thank you again to Rugby Morning's John Fitzpatrick for joining us, stepping in to the hosting role. Again, you can follow him at Rugby Morning for that curated daily email that you get that includes all rugby information, domestic and beyond. Again, John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning, longtime OG Fantasy Ruckers League member. Thank you for joining the show. But it is time for OVALYe, presented by OVALYe. And it's time to get into breaking down how we approach this thing called OVALYe, whether it is the free-to-play tournaments, the limited tournaments, the rare tournaments, all of the competitions to help you, the viewers, earn some rewards, finish high in those leaderboards. And this past week was an interesting one, and I think it emphasized one important thing when it comes to OVALYe, and that is matchups, matchups, matchups. And that's something that you're going to find out is going to be something we talk a lot about here on the Fantasy Rucker Show when it comes to OVALYe, is really taking advantage of matchups that play in your favor, that boost that probability that you select guys, or you have guys, purchase guys, invest in guys that are going to do well for you on your weekly basis when you decide to make those lineups. And in this past week, the matchup that we were hammering home in the past episode was that matchup between the New England Free Jacks and the Anthem Rugby Carolina squad. And we know, according to the Fantasy Ruckers analytics, Anthem RC is allowing some of the most fantasy points to the all positions in MLR. Anthem RC, whether it's front row, second row, back row, scrum half, fly half, center, back 3, you name it, that is the team that you want to score matchups against. Now, coming into playoffs, that's not going to play as much, but it does emphasize that point, like we said in those previous episodes, that those matchups are important to pinpoint. And you can see here in the free-to-play lineup, went heavy with those New England Free Jacks guys. Of course, Semi Kunitani is a guy that you have in your lineup each and every single week. But Quadrant, 2 tries, Potros, incredible from the boot, a lot of try assists as well. Wayne Vanderbank, he's a staple as well. All those guys really capitalizing on that matchup against Anthem RC, who, again, according to Fantasy Ruckers analytics, is really doing or is really allowing a lot of fantasy production against the team that is opposing them. So again, highlighting matchups, it kind of emphasizes how we're going to approach the upcoming weeks. We do have some time to kind of reflect and think about how we will be approaching the Major League Rugby playoffs when it comes to OVALYe. And again, matchups are going to play a part of that. But because we have the couple weeks, we have the matchup set, and we have those guys that we can pinpoint from certain squads. Obviously, Houston taking on Dallas with that 1 to 4 seed, Seattle taking on San Diego in that 2 and 3 seed in the Western Conference. And then over on the Eastern Conference, we got New England 1 taking on DC 4, and then NOLA 2 taking on Chicago. So we're going to go into those matchups and really pinpoint which guys that we can highlight and which guys we can really take advantage of when it comes to fantasy production, who will bode well for your OVALYe lineups, and therefore putting you high on the leaderboards and getting you some rewards. Now, the kind of approach that we're taking to playoffs is a little bit different when it comes to your investment tournaments, whether it's the limited, rare, or beyond tournaments when it comes to OVALYe. And the biggest point of advice that we can give OVALYe players when it comes to playoffs is looking at this bracket and just siding with your gut in terms of who you think is going to do the best, who you think is going to go far into these playoffs, and ultimately competing for that MLR shield in the championship round in August 4th. And the reason why we bring that up is because that is what you are doing. You are making an investment. And if you're going to purchase players now for guys that are going to pay off for you in the upcoming weeks, you're going to want to pick players from a team that you know that are going far, so you don't have to turn around in a following week, following the semifinals, you have a guy that is on a team that is eliminated, and you're going to have to find a filler spot. So the best way to kind of mitigate that is to pick sides and squads that you think are going to do well in the upcoming MLR playoffs. And whether that you think you're a Houston guy, whether you're a New England guy, whether you think there's going to be an upset, just go with your gut in terms of who you believe is going to go far in that tournament. So if you believe that it's going to be New England, and you're going to want to take guys that are going to be that are going to pay off for you during that 3-week stretch, use that filter on the trade market. You think it's going to be New England, you select on that New England filter, and there's a handful of guys that you can purchase on that trade market that are going to do well for you. Paulo Balikana did really well in that final week against Anthem RC. Can he continue that into playoffs against DC and the guys that they're going to be facing if they move on in that semifinal and final matchup? That's the guy that you can capitalize on. Handful of guys that will be available for you. Again, just side with those guys that you think are going to go far. And even if that's an upset, even if you're picking a Chicago Hounds player, Dallas Jackals player, just go with what you believe is going to go far. And that way you're making a one-time investment that's going to pay off for you in the several weeks that is the fantasy MLR playoffs. When it comes to the free-to-play tournament, though, hey, it's again what we said and began this segment with. It is matchup, matchup, matchup. You go in matchups that I'm liking in these early fantasy playoffs. That Houston Dallas matchup is going to be nice. I will be pounding Houston players into that lineup. And I also think that Seattle and San Diego is actually going to be a high scoring affair. We saw that happen in the last round of the regular season in round 18. That could be the same thing happening in the first round semifinals of the MLR playoffs with guys like Devon Rousseau, guys like Thomas Awake, guys like Mac Mason. These are guys that you're going to want to look out for. So it's whether it's shootouts or it's going to be a lopsided affair. Those are the two things you're going to pinpoint out of. The Eastern Conference is really a crapshoot. So harder to find matchups that you're more confident in. I'm liking the Western Conference matchups better, but again, free-to-play tournament, look at those matchup based when it comes to the limited, the rare tournaments. Really try to invest in those guys that you believe are going to go far in the MLR playoffs, which will give you the best bang for your buck. So that is OVALYe presented by OVALYe. Now it's time to go into the last segment of the show, Devin's Degenerate Dambles. And of course, we have a few weeks to kind of reflect on those bets that we have been making and those bets that we plan to make heading into the fantasy MLR playoffs. And when you look at that playoff bracket, I think that a lot of the favorites are really on the easier side to pinpoint. We might see a little bit of surprise as we get closer to it, but I really think that all of the home teams will be favored in that first round of the MLR playoffs in that semifinals. I think Houston will be favored against Dallas. Seattle, because of that home field advantage, and we know how electric that home field can get, will be favored in that matchup against San Diego. New England against DC. New England pretty confident they'll be favored in that one, of course, being the number 1 seed. And then NOLA Chicago. That one is a little bit closer, but again, because of the home field advantage, I do think NOLA will be favored. So when you're looking at that lineup where the value is to be had, I think honestly, like we mentioned earlier in the show when I was talking with Fitzy about an underlying team that you think can go in there and make a far push, I think you're looking at those Eastern Conference teams. You look at DC, an upset is possible. Fitzy said it himself. I mean, 1-point games between DC and New England. I know it's in New England, but like Fitzy said, DC has had in the past, at least in 2024, shown that they can compete if they're running on all cylinders against New England. That might be an upset to be had. And again, I like Chicago in this one. They can go far if the cards fall right. NOLA, you never know what you can predict on a week in and week out basis. So if the odds do play in Chicago's favor, that might be a value play as well. When it comes to a parlay, we know Vandy loves his parlay. And this is going to be one that I'm going with a whole bunch of upsets. If Seattle is favored in that matchup, I think a nice parlay between San Diego, DC, Chicago, combine those upsets that you think are going to happen. I think there's going to be a whole lot of value had. Again, we're still far ways off. We got the international break coming up, a little bit time to see how things play out, but at least the early inklings here are that there is going to be value in that Eastern Conference and maybe a possible parlay when you include San Diego. I'm staying away from that Houston-Dallas matchup. Don't think Dallas has an opportunity or a chance to beat Houston. I wouldn't choose the upset bet there. Again, not knowing the odds. If it's really crazy, maybe you can drop maybe a small bet on that, but I think Houston will be so favored in that matchup. It's going to be a tough one, and it might just be a wash when it comes to investing into that matchup. But it'll be interesting to see, and we'll see whether or not sports books will give an opportunity for people to maybe put some money on who they think will win the championship. Yet to be seen. But again, the matchups going into there, like the Eastern Conference, like a little parlay with some upsets, it should be an interesting one. Well, it was a great episode 115. Thank you again to John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning for helping me host this thing. Maddie, Vandy will be back next week. Maddie out in the boonies camping up in Canada. Vandy enjoying his Canada Day at the time of this recording the podcast. So happy Canada Day to all of our Canadian viewers, and also happy 4th of July to all of our American viewership as well. Enjoy the weekend, be safe, enjoy the holidays. It should be a fun one. Have a little break until the fantasy MLR playoffs, but we will be back next week. Of course, we're going to be bringing you interviews. We're going to continue the weekly challenge through playoffs and a whole bunch more as we continue to make this journey of fantasy MLR a reality in Major League Rugby. For Matt Yee, for Devin, Vandy, Vanderpool, I'm Ryan Yee. We'll see you next week on another episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.